Dear viewers, near and far, my name is Kristján Kristjánsson from the Jubilee Center for Character and Virtues at the University of Birmingham. Welcome to this webinar about police ethics run by the Jubilee Center for Character and Virtues. So we are the world's largest research center studying the role of character, strengths and virtues in human associations, including professional life. And we think the time is ripe to look at police work and police ethics under this research lens for two reasons at least. The first one is that the current pandemic has thrown up a lot of new issues testing the character of police officers. And secondly, police education in the UK is being leveled up. A lot of it will now take place within university degree courses. And this has created new academic space for a deeper exploration of ethical issues in policing. This webinar is part of a large research project that we are just starting in the Jubilee Center about character virtues in UK policing. So we will be administering surveys, conducting interviews with students, with police professionals, and with police educators. And we will also be creating in due course an educational intervention to enhance wise decision-making in police work. If you want to stay updated on this project, then you can visit the project page, which you will find on the Jubilee Center web, and we will be updating it regularly with information about our findings. So now it's time to turn to the webinar itself. We are extremely privileged to have with us today 6 distinguished experts on police ethics in a UK context. We've got Peter Neyroud from University of Cambridge. We've got Professor Alison McQueen from Bath Spa University. We've got Rob Wins from Birmingham City University. We've got Chris Todd, who's representing our local police force, the West Midlands Police, where he is Assistant Chief Constable. We've got John McDaniel from University of Wolverhampton, and finally we've got Andy Hill, who used to work as a police academic in the UK, but is now a director of the police science studies at the University of Akureyri in Iceland. So what we did, we asked these 6 experts to prepare a short position paper about the changing nature of police work in the UK, about police education in the UK, or about police dilemmas, the common dilemmas in police work. And these papers will be made available on the Police Project web at the Jubilee Center in a few days' time. So today I will be asking these 6 experts on police science and criminology to talk us through these papers in less than 5 minutes. We've got 6 people. All of them will be speaking for a maximum of 5 minutes. It's going to take about 30 minutes all in all. And after that, I will open the floor up to questions from the audience. And I ask people to write the questions in a chat function, and I will sort of look at them and read through them and deliver them to the people you are asking. Please remember to mention when you write up your question whom you're asking. I mean, are you asking one of the speakers your question? Then put the name of the speaker at the beginning of your question. So the order of the speakers will be as follows. I will be asking Peter to start, and then Chris. They will be talking about the changing nature of policing in the UK. After that, Ron and Andy will be talking about police education and how that is changing as well, not only in the UK, but actually in various countries around the globe. And finally, Alison and John will be talking about common dilemmas that police officers meet with. So let's just crack on and begin with Peter Neyroud from the University of Cambridge, talking about the changing face of policing in the UK. Peter, over to you.
Thank you. And I'm doing this not just as an academic from Cambridge. I happen to be a member of SAGE as well. And I'm currently doing work for both the UN and the US Congress on the policing and the rule of law. can't imagine why the latter would be interested. The paper I've written is about the changing face of policing, and I'm not going to just go through every line of it. I'm going to pick out some issues. It starts from the kind of wider experience of anyone who's been a police chief or been involved in studying policing, that policing goes through cycles of crisis and periods of reform. But there's a common feature running at the moment, and which has, I think, been running for the last 3 or 4 years, which is a sense of really quite a major crisis in legitimacy. Firstly, there was Obama's Commission on Policing, which identified the key theme of the inappropriate use of force and the over-policing of minorities, and the need to address a legitimacy gap. In the United Kingdom, we've had a period of fairly unprecedented, certainly not since the 1970s, unprecedented squeeze on both policing and the police role, and in particular a withdrawal from some of the more traditional functions like community policing as a result of the cut. So forcing choices, but forcing choices at a time when a range of functions have been putting significant pressure on the police to increase their role. So particularly functions to do with counter-terrorism, preventing radicalisation, dealing with organised crime and cybercrime. Cybercrime in particular has been jumping hugely in the middle of COVID, let alone before. And that's put pressure on what I would describe as the basic policing that most people experience, the 24-hour local patrol, handling volume crime investigation, the piece that people see. And it's made it extremely difficult for policing to sustain the bit that people think they're paying for, whilst at the same time the pressure on to try and keep levels of violent crime down. We've seen, not just in the UK, but across quite a number of countries, a turning round of quite a long-term reduction in violent crime. Whilst at the same time, some of the instruments that the police have been, the tactics that the police have used to try and tackle those things, such as stop and search, have come under very acute scrutiny. COVID-19 has in some ways just accelerated the change. It's forced policing from the streets in some ways. It's forced policing into the front of trying to deal with public health, which has been a considerable challenge for policing for quite some time. It's very difficult to get information from health. Whilst at the same time, the police have been required, not just in the UK, but I've done a survey with a colleague across the world. They've been required to provide the most extreme restrictions of liberties since the Second World War, and they've tried to do so by balancing restrictions with encouragement for compliance. It's been a tightrope walked against the backdrop of all the pressures that I've mentioned, and I think that combination, which doesn't seem likely to go away anytime soon, means that police have been presented with some extremely stark choices about how to ration. And you could probably draw parallels with the challenges that are going on at the moment with exactly how do we manage our way out of the crisis of COVID, which is the balance of the impacts of policing. So, for example, the use of stop and search with the benefits, maybe the reduction in violence. And of course, they affect different communities. The communities, for example, who want to use public space may well want to see stop and search to try and restrict crimes in those areas. Others may find themselves being on the end of that. Those choices are really, really difficult, and they become more difficult in the light of the events that were going on in the midst of the pandemic, and notably the explosion of worldwide interest following the death of George Floyd and the acceleration of the Black Lives Matter movement. That means that the focus really has to come into the ways in which leaders not just make the choices but explain the choices. And I think that accelerates the need to consider how leadership isn't just conceived in terms of some dichotomy between transaction and transformation, but focuses far, far more on ethics, the development of ethical decision making, and the way in which that is explained and set out for the public. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Peter. This was excellent. It was a good beginning. And we'll continue with the same theme, look at it from the perspective of people who are actually there in the field, on the floor, so to speak. So over to you, Chris, about the changing face of policing in the UK.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. So yes, I've looked at the question around the way in which police engage with ethical issues in the 21st century, and I've approached this from a consideration of what might be described now as a modern machine age, and where policing fits into that, and specifically the impact on policing legitimacy and the requirements that brings of leaders in policing. So quite predictably, perhaps in my paper, I've started with reference to the Pelian principles, and but purposely slow, because I think, you know, it's well established that they are seen as the bedrock of policing, and have sustained over a couple of centuries. But there's a thread that runs through all of those 9 principles, which is around legitimacy, and I think it's still recognised that policing in the UK, at least, is all about legitimacy and ethical behaviour of police officers and the police service supports and underpins that legitimacy and ensures that we maintain legitimacy. But trust is fragile, it can be fragile, and as times change, policing needs to change with that in order that we maintain that legitimacy. We need to be agile in order to adapt as society requires of us. The modern machine age brings about specific circumstances which impact the way in which we need to adjust our approach to policing, such as the wider introduction of technology, the use of data analytics and such like, and that requires a different approach to ethics, but also the unique circumstances which are beyond our control. We need to adapt to those, as Peter just referenced, some of the things that we've been experiencing of late, be it the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, or the broader global pandemic, and the need to police within that environment. So we pride ourselves in policing on being able to adapt and operate in that agile way, and we pride ourselves on it was predictable that the lights would go out as I was talking there with the timer on this switch, so excuse me going into the dark for those of you watching on the camera. But sorry, we pride ourselves on being agile and being able to respond in an ethical way, because our decision-making model has ethics and values at the centre of it. But I've referenced in my paper the fourth estate. So, you know, we talk about those that determine the laws, that judge the application of those laws, and that they execute the just implication of those laws. When the fourth estate is around the media, but in the modern machine age, when we talk about the media and the reflection on how we do all of that, it's more than just the mainstream media. It's about social media, it's activity online, and that leads us to a principle or a phenomenon of ad hominem. I'm going to have to stand up for a moment if you don't mind. And just turn my lights back on. Sorry about that. So as I was saying, that leads us to this kind of principle of ad hominem, and that's basically the principle of, there's a very kind of a specific definition of that which I've referenced in the paper, but in layperson's terms, what that is about attacking the messenger rather than the message, really. And we can rely upon evidence bases, as we do in policing. We can build up the evidence, we can demonstrate transparency in order to maintain legitimacy. But if people are intent on attacking the messenger rather than the message, then that's not necessarily enough. So the question is, how do we deal with that? And again, in this modern age, not only is it more prevalent because of the advent of social media, etc., but also the vectors are more extensive, and the velocity is greater. So we really do need to be agile and able to adapt to that. So some of that, you know, when we come back to data analytics again, so we look at the way in which we demonstrate transparency around the use of algorithms in policing, because we see that from the A levels, issues earlier this year that trust is not cannot be assumed. So in the West Midlands Police, for example, we've established a data ethics committee to drill down into the detail around those new capabilities that we develop. But again, that's not enough if people don't believe the message because they don't trust the messenger. So we might be transparent, we might publish everything we possibly can, we might produce the evidence base, but those that seek to challenge us will say, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? So how do we deal with those issues? And for me, it comes back to those Peelian principles, and it comes back to the thread that runs through all of those around legitimacy and the style of leadership. And for me, leadership is about a number of things, but one of those things is humility. And there's a suggestion that in a modern machine age, what's required from leaders is greater emotional intelligence and humility. And I think that's something which perhaps traditionally in policing has been overlooked at times. So we have a tradition of lending ourselves to sometimes transactional, autocratic style of leadership. And you look at the military kind of influences, which I know some of the other speakers will reference later on, and that's understandable. But in this modern machine age, we absolutely need humility in order to demonstrate our humanity when we're working alongside technology and we're facing growing threats from things like the fake news, which is effectively ad hominem, which will attack the message that we're portraying, rather attack those that convey the message rather than the message itself. So humility, I think, is running throughout the Peelian principles. So it stands for leaders now in the 21st century, as it did then, in order that we can continue to police in an ethical way.
Thanks a lot, Chris. This was excellent. And you brought up a character virtue that some people might not automatically connect to policing, namely humility, but this was a very, very interesting connection. Thanks. We'll turn now to the second theme, which is about police education. So the changing face of policing in the UK and elsewhere definitely calls for a different style, different content, and different teaching methods in police education. So to talk about these changes, it's Ron and Andy, and I'll ask Ron to begin.
Well, thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. In considering my paper, I'll ask you to consider whether policing is a profession or a craft, and I've titled the paper Professional Craft, Police Education and the Professionalisation Agenda. So in terms of some context, if you like, I think the professionalisation agenda in policing in England and Wales is actually quite well established, and I think, you know, we can thank people like Peter around that, the Neyroud review from 2011, the formation of the College of Policing a year later, and thinking about reforms in police education, borrowing heavily from other professions and thinking about a profession as consisting of largely three key areas, which is a code of ethics, depository of research, and accredited educational qualifications. And that borrows heavily from medicine, law, engineering, teaching, etc. Within policing, arguably there is already implemented a robust code of ethics, along with, you know, a lot of growing and highly credible evidence-based practice and research, and people like Professor Lawrence Sherman, and even the police service itself with the Society of Evidence-Based Policing. You know, these are key areas and key drivers for, you know, basing evidence practice in relation to reforming policing practice and contributing to that professionalisation agenda. And it's only very recently that we've seen that step change in terms of police education itself within the development of the police education qualification framework and mandating a degree entry for policing in England and Wales from 2019. Now, that's really interesting because, you know, a key question here is, you know, why has it taken a little while longer to get the police education qualification framework upstanding and mandating degree entry? And it's not without controversy. And, you know, a number of former colleagues of mine in policing have sort of, indicated actually some of the best cops I've ever worked with haven't had a degree, and a degree isn't necessary for policing. But the key argument is that actually, as Chris has kind of alluded to, policing, and Peter for that matter, policing is a changing, developing and highly complex endeavour, and it's becoming increasingly so. When we think about technology, we think about the changing face of crime. So we look at the degree entry as examining that aspect of policing as a profession or craft, and I'd invite you to kind of think about those areas as we're going through this conversation this afternoon. Well, why is policing historically seen as an artisan endeavour? And part of that, I would argue, has been about the history of policing and the history of police pay. Unsurprisingly, in 1829, a police officer was paid more than a labourer, but less than a skilled man, and that kind of re-emphasises the blue-collar nature of policing. And it wasn't really until arguably the first Thatcher government in 1979 that, with the implementation in full of Edmund Davis, that policing was actually, police pay was fully brought up to date, as it were. Arguably, degree entry, creates time and space for officers to think. And in terms of some of those arguments, we've seen, well, do we get situations of paralysis by analysis? Officers considering over-intellectualizing problems and situations instead of, considering some areas of policing that have to be dealt with on an emergency basis and have to be addressed immediately. So, we can all think of those ethical dilemmas that might be to the detriment of delivering effective services to the public when officers may be sort of thinking about things and overthinking things rather than, adopting that craft element of policing and acting immediately. I think what I'll do is I'll draw a close to things now. It's in terms of thinking about actually what influences of senior leaders and policymakers got on policing as it becomes much more professional, and thinking about degree level entry. And this is something that the police service must get absolutely right. It is really absolutely critical. There are some arguments in higher education about how well people from Black and ethnic minorities, Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities do in higher education. There's something like a 13% deficit between white students in terms of achieving a good quality degree. So for me, the argument is around retention and career progression for Black, Asian and minority ethnic recruits into policing, to really make sure that policing reflects the communities that they serve. I think finally, what I would say is that no one knows what the future holds. Policing, in the quotation of Tim Brain, is that the history of policing over the past few decades is a journey of ultimate progress. But of course, this progress has been far from smooth or predictable, and I think that indicates the future in where we're going and the future of education in policing for the future. So I think I'll stop there, Kristján, and hand over.
Thanks a lot, Ron, and thank you for relating your discussion to the old debate about whether professions are to be seen as a praxis in the Aristotelian sense, or a techne, or a craft. And it's interesting that the same discussion was being held in Athens 2,300 years ago about various professions like teaching and medicine and being a soldier. They didn't have professional police officers in Athens, but they obviously had soldiers and teachers and medics, and the same discussion took place then about what's the relationship between this profession as a moral practice and as a craft. So again, we are seeing this reflected in this kind of old debate being reflected in contemporary discourse about policing. Right, so it's over to Andy, who has overseen the transfer of police education in Iceland from a sort of secondary school level to university level in recent years.
Thank you, Kristján, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm I'm obviously very happy to be here in Iceland. You can see the northern lights behind me. I'm afraid the traditional view would be much more boring in just white because we have a lot of snow. So I come to this having been a police officer, both with the British military police and with the civilian police, the Thames Valley Police, which Peter was, of course, Chief Constable before going on to Centrex. And someone who didn't go to university, somebody who didn't have a university or even a college level education before joining both the military police and the civilian police. And I was fortunate enough near the end of my career to become a police trainer at a regional police training centre, and then moved on to De Montfort University in Leicester, where I established the first, for the early adopters, the first police education program. And this was a very bumpy ride, the establishment of a police education program in the UK in 2006. And I'm going through very similar issues here in Iceland. I talk very frequently with my colleagues in Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark. Been in 3 very long meetings this week already with them, and they're battling, debating some of the issues that have already been raised today by Ron and Peter and Chris. And this is a global issue, and certainly it's a Nordic issue. I've just picked out 5 things that I want to summarize in my paper, or that I summarized. The history of policing is really important. Where is policing come from in this country? You know, back to the Bow Street Runners or hue and cry. But actually, you know, if we talk about the new police officers need to understand the journey that the police service in the UK has gone through from its earliest days with 1829 with Sir Robert Peel. Of course, the Peelian principles is relevant in 2021 as they were, as has already been said. But understanding the role and functions of police from those days, and understanding how things have changed and how things have evolved in policing. I think it's hugely important to recognise where police officers come from, and that needs to be understood not just in a local context, but also internationally as well. Over the years, over the last 50 years in particular, maybe 60 years, I'm getting old, most change, but not all, has been externally driven. Most of the changes in terms of policing, police training, police education has been externally driven. Yes, of course, the Her Majesty's Inspectorate have completed reports, training matters, diversity matters, etc. But actually, a lot of it has been driven externally by Scarman, the Stephen Lawrence Inquiry Report, just to name 2. And the police have not always responded as positively to the recommendations, neither has the Home Office, in fairness, but the police have not always responded. But so much of the change that's happened has been externally driven, and I think that comes back to the point. Sorry.
Continue.
Okay. And I think some of this comes back to the fact that policing has historically been a craft, a blue collar, a working class occupation where university education was just for those who were going to go off and get promoted or go into specialisms. And I think whereas in medicine, in education and other professions, and I like what you were saying, Ron, about profession and craft, I think we need to recognize that development of practice, that method has not been driven internally, it's been external, and I think that's been a problem, although things of course are changing. But police training, which has dominated for the last 200 years, is only a part of what a police officer needs to be successful in their work over the next 30 or 40 years. They need training, but it needs to be high quality training based on the realities of today and tomorrow, not based on what was relevant 20, 30 or 40 years ago. So it needs to be forward looking, not backward looking. And we find that unfortunately, there are many training practices which are based on the experience of trainers in their own training 10, 20, 30 years before. Now, that's not always the case, but that's often the case. And of course, the values and the virtues My apologies. So the virtues that were recognized as being, you know, the most desirable have changed slightly. There has been some change, but the quality of police training needs to go in, high quality police training needs to go hand in hand with high quality police education. And that's education around professional ethics, some criminology, some sociology, some psychology, and of course, knowledge of the law. And what I believe we need in the future is a police service which is made up of those with professional skills and craft, academic skills that can be applied, so that we actually generate a police workforce of pracademics, as I know is a term that's been used quite a lot in of late, where we create the next generation, not only of police leaders, but of police educators. And I think this is hugely important, that we transition from valuing high quality training alone to valuing high quality police education with training. And I have a real issue with this, that any university that wants to apply can as long as they meet the College of Policing standards, can establish a police education program. And I'm not sure that's a good thing. We need to have specialist university education for police officers as well as high quality training. There's been a paradigm shift, and we know that some of the drivers for that was Scarman, Stephen Lawrence Inquiry Report, McPherson, the Elliott and Kushner report, of course, Peter Neyroud's report, amongst others, have driven the change. But I think that we are still in transition. I don't think that we've reached the end yet. I think we are still going through a paradigm shift in terms of the education of police officers. So just to finish, I think, for me, professional ethics sits at the heart of professional education in training. Training in terms of the handcuffing, the first aid, the restraint techniques and things like that. The education in terms of understanding human and social diversity, understanding prejudice, discrimination and oppression. But that links back to my first point, which is about understanding where the police has come from, the role and function of the modern police officer, and where we're going. So for me, it's about preparing police officers for their future role and not preparing them for the past. And I think I'll just stop there, if that's okay, Kristján.
Thanks a lot, Andy. That was really relevant and helpful. Thank you. To think about the historical dimension and where we are heading, and obviously we are hoping that the educational materials that we plan to provide in the future will help with some of that training, especially the training in dealing with ethical issues. Great. So now we'll turn to moral dilemmas in police work. Obviously, on a daily basis, a good professional is not making choices between a virtue and a vice. But that doesn't mean that there are not moral problems to deal with, because in many cases we have to choose between two different virtues where they seem to collide or be in conflict. And that creates what are called moral dilemmas, difficult choices. And those abound in policing, as we'll hear from Alison and John. So Alison, over to you.
Thank you, Kristján. I'm going to address three key questions in my paper. The first is, what is the most common ethical dilemmas that police officers encounter on a daily basis? The second question deals with, are they well equipped to address these dilemmas? And the third question is there a role for moral character in negotiating these dilemmas, or does it all come down to written rules and codified practices? I've drawn on some research from the Southwest and London and Wales.
I'm afraid we are losing you now. You might want to turn off your camera just to increase the bandwidth. Okay. I think we will just change over to John, ask John to deliver his paper now and see whether Alison can sort out the technology while we wait. So, John, if it's okay with you, I'll just hand over to you now. You're also speaking about the moral dilemmas.
Okay, thank you very much, Kristján, and good afternoon, everybody. I was going to say it's a pleasure to bring up the rear, but I'm no longer doing that. And I was going to say I hope I don't bring down the standard so far, which it's been very impressive. My position, essentially talking about ethical dilemmas, is that there's an increasing need to develop new structures, processes, and training tools to address prevalent ethical dilemmas. Some occurrences are arguably so similar and widespread that more prescriptive written rules could be formulated, and even new forms of character education could be introduced to help guide trade-offs and priorities in decision-making. Although a plethora of written rules and statutory requirements already exist, such as the Standards of Professional Behaviour and the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, considerable areas exist where officers' moral characters appear to dominate, and not always in the most desirable ways. Some of these grey zones exist by design. For instance, in my position paper, I set out that impact factors that one can find in police training guidance mean that officers can attach significant weight to personal feelings of safety. These can emanate from degrees of confidence they have in self-defense techniques, and even differences in height and weight. They can be used to justify the use of handcuffs in pre-arrest settings, such as stop and search, even where this may be seen as unfair or overzealous by members of the public, and where the same concerns of personal safety may not be shared by their colleagues. And for the watching public, who see young people in particular being stopped and searched, and the application of handcuffs takes place, might not recognise that the individual isn't being arrested. So it sends a significant message to the community. The second dilemma concerned a reluctance of police supervisors to use informal means to address low-level allegations against BAME officers. And this can come down to a lack of confidence in their what's referred to as cultural competence to deal with matters, and out of fear of being called a racist for challenging BAME officers. This is reportedly, according to a report by the National Police Chiefs Council in 2019, contributing to a raft of cases being referred to professional standards departments around England and Wales. In other words, passing the buck. The same managers don't report similar feelings when dealing with white officers, who they frequently deal with by way of informal corridor conversations, whereas those concerning BAME officers are kicked upstairs to PSDs. It's their problem to deal with, so to speak. So as you can see, there's a theme emerging in those two dilemmas between values of self-preservation and virtues of fairness and ideas of the public good. The final dilemma that I discussed concerned officers' experiences of being under investigation for police misconduct. Where they're not dismissed, their experiences can manifest into a real reluctance to use physical force upon their return to duty, primarily to avoid the dreaded return of what many officers refer to as the sword of Damocles. So although various structures and processes and rules exist to keep virtues of public service and fairness at the forefront of officers' minds, perhaps the greatest challenge is that police forces have yet to solve how to sufficiently motivate frontline officers and managers to use those structures and processes and rules, and to keep those virtues of public service and fairness at the forefront of their minds, and not dominant issues of self-preservation, which are instinctive. motivate them to use those structures and processes if they are fit for purpose, and that's kind of a separate issue. But I think that the crux of my paper and my concern is how do we motivate officers and managers to think the way that the models and the structures and the processes expect them to. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, John. This was very helpful. We came up with 6 dilemmas for the survey that we are going to be administering to police officers and students in the next few weeks, but none of them are similar to the 3 you mentioned. So it just shows the great variety of dilemmas that the police have to deal with on a daily basis. I hope, Alison, that the connection has been re-established and that you can now deliver your paper.
Yes, I have. I don't know, it just bounced out there. So what I'm going to do is just keep my video off and just speak through.
Sure.
So as I was saying, the first question is, what is the most common dilemma that police officers face? And I've drawn from the number of dilemmas that have been submitted over the last 5 years within forces across the Southwest, London and Wales police forces. And to date, there's been over 350 dilemmas. And certainly out on top, the most common theme is dealing with mental health issues and crises, where they have to respond to that. The second dilemma is actually where it just doesn't feel morally right to the police officer or the police staff who's dealing with the issue. It makes them feel uncomfortable. And then the third one, which is a more recent one, has been issues around policing in the pandemic, policing in COVID. And that's really been related where law has been made very, very quickly and had to be interpreted into policy and practice. And I think we saw, how do you define local for the purposes of policing is a common one. But I just want to talk through one of those before I answer the second 2 questions. And I'm going to talk to the one around the mental health issues, because that was overwhelmingly the most common theme across the police force in the Southwest. And here it's quite clear often when the police officer attends to the person who's suffering from a mental health crisis, and perhaps they represent a danger to themselves or to others, that person needs to be assessed urgently by the mental health team. The police now have a partnership with the mental health team, but quite often there's different responses. So one of the themes was actually this person is presenting this way because it's part of their attention process. And actually by being here, you're facilitating their mental health crises. So the mental health team will take their leave, but police officers, from their own experience, believe that that person seriously will commit serious harm either to themselves or to others. And so what do? They may have to, they can't arrest them in their own home. So they have another dilemma. How do they get them out of their home if they want to arrest them to take them to a place of safety? If they get them out of their home, then how do they transport them? So often these when they face these ethical issues, it's a collective set of ethical issues. It's not just one on their own. They're constantly emerging and constantly aggregating, which is quite interesting. The second one, which is where it's almost a moral affront to the officer dealing with it. I've put one here around responding to young children who've been found with child sexual abuse images on their computer. And quite often these children are primary school age. And it's now commonplace, apparently, that children of that age will share pictures of themselves in a state of nakedness. And so when children sort of click on these images and they go onto sites, they inadvertently or accidentally click on a site and download a whole set of indecent images. And once the school are aware, they have to notify the police. When the police are notified, they have to take a course of action. And whichever course of action it takes means that that young child will get a criminal record. And having a criminal record means that it may impact upon his future life choices. So that's the sort of second theme on that. In terms of are they well equipped to address these dilemmas, I think from my perspective, no. It's not just about making a decision. I mean, first of all, the officer has to recognise that actually they are dealing with an ethical dilemma. And what type of ethical dilemma is it? And once they've established it may be an ethical dilemma, how do they know what the real nub of that ethical dilemma is? And what, if you've got the nub, what really are the considerations? So they've got to analyse moral uncertainty or conflict. And when they make a decision, do they have the resources? Do they have the support to be able to deliver that? And finally, when they make an ethical dilemma decision, it's often about creating or giving harm to another party. Have they considered that, and have they taken into account how they might mitigate some of that? So I think there's a set of skills and competencies around ethical decision making and ethical dilemmas that they haven't been taught. And I think that leads to the next question: is there a role for moral character, or does it come down to the code of ethics and other practices? Well, I think when you get organisations, and it was a conversation I had with Professor Philip McCormack, who's in the army, who said that are conferred with powers that are morally intrusive. And policing is morally intrusive. They have a whole range of powers, be it stop and search, be it use of force, be it covert surveillance. Then they have to act and think and behave as moral agents. So therefore there is agency. Otherwise, you just will not, you will act, you will comply unthinkingly with orders. And that's not necessarily the right thing to do. So they do have to draw upon their own set of virtues to help inform them. Again, I did some work with the Royal Navy, and I came up with a chart that looked around the factors affecting professional ethical decision making. And it was a very dynamic development. But what I managed to get into, what does inform actually ethical decision making? And there's wider societal teachings of the individual. There's instrumental or explicit directives. So for the police, that would be the code of ethics, the standard operation procedures, and of course they change. They change over time. Then there's the personalised and family teaching. So your family life, your life experience, your cognitive bias, the past experience of that particular decision or similar decisions you've made, and the outcome of it. There was also situational directives. So actually, if you are physically separated from the normal hub of where you work, you're more likely to engage in unethical decision making. So, the covert police officers and their inquiry, it's quite interesting that they are away from the hub of the organisation and isolated. The submarine service is exactly the same, and you see similar behaviours around their ethical decision making. And then there's the harmony and intrinsic values, your leadership, followership, the culture that you're immersed in, and the prevailing sense of individual or collective organisational identity. So if you have a strong identity with your organisation, you're more likely to make ethical decisions when you're faced with an ethical dilemma. So I think for those alone, actually the code of ethics is not a helpful instrument, and it's further impeded by the fact that it's statutory. Which can create unethical behaviour, because if you're a covert police officer, you are going to lie and you are going to deceive people. That is part of good practice. So I will leave it at there, but I think I made my position around that fairly clear.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Alison. And obviously when Alison was describing the different components of good moral decision making, she was basically describing the components that, again, hark back to Aristotle's discussion of what he called phronesis, taking good decisions about when different values and virtues come into conflict. Well, this was fantastic. Thank you all so much for your contributions. And as I said earlier, the full papers will be made available on the police project website in a few days' time, as well as the recording of this webinar. So now it's time for questions, and I see that people are already starting to write those up on chat, so that's fantastic. I will go through those one by one in a couple of minutes. I would like to kick off though by asking Peter a question about this crisis of legitimacy that he was talking about. So a couple of questions, Peter. One is general. I mean, is it really fair to compare the situation in the USA with that in the UK? I mean, isn't the crisis much more serious in the US, or would you say that, I mean, it's just a matter of degree, a difference rather than an essential difference? And secondly, what does this crisis have to do with the individual moral agency of police officers, sort of in the cut and thrust of police work?
Yes, it's a very long question, Gianfranco. I mean, there is, right, so there is a difference of character, but in terms of the, and it's difficult to generalize actually anything with the United States, because apart from Trump, because I mean, the different parts of the United States behave really quite differently. But there are some common threads. So one of them is actually a real, we're running through a period where there's a real asking of the question of what are the police for, and that's partly because of the you know, the financial restraints, but it's also the fact that the role has expanded. That's one of the reasons behind the Alex Vitale analysis on the end of policing, which is that policing has expanded to fill gaps that others have retreated from, and in the process has found itself in sticky territory, of which mental health is one. And yes, there is an opportunity for change, and it does go to the heart of the moral character, particularly of leadership, to be able to advocate for the boundaries and where the role stops. There's always a temptation, you know, running any organisation, to want to take everything that happens to come along, and having been involved in a series of processes in my career, including one thing which was called the review of core and ancillary tasks, it's really difficult to shed stuff. But sometimes you actually have do actually have to articulate and advocate for boundaries, and use so I think this comes into institutional theory. Use the institutional sovereigns to be able to assist you in doing that, and that does take moral courage, because you know there are always circumstances in which you could be asked to step in, and the COVID debate has put that starkly into the forefront.
Thanks, Peter. So I'll start with the questions now that you have posed to the speakers. I've got a question for Alison first regarding the ethical dilemmas. Do you think it would be useful to sort of collect a body of ethical dilemmas and use them in teaching, for example, in CPD courses, or do you know if dilemmas are already being used a lot in police education?
They are. They certainly are being collected and analysed at this moment, and there's a paper being written by myself and a medical practitioner, Professor Papilos, who sits on the chair of the Avon and Somerset Committee. Certainly in Devon and Cornwall and Dorset, the ethical dilemmas are fed back into their training. At the national level, we now have a UK police ethics network, and again that's fed back into organisational learning as well as other bodies. So they are being utilised effectively. They're not just a talking shop.
Right. There's a more specific question for you as well, Alison, regarding the dilemmas you were referring to. The 350 ethical dilemmas submitted. Is there any way of accessing those dilemmas, particularly for lecturers, to incorporate them into their teaching?
Yes, we're in the middle of looking at those now. We're writing a separate paper on the ethical dilemmas relating to mental health, which we should finish certainly by April. In terms of those being made available, if any organisation links into their local police force, because most police forces now have an ethics committee, so I think they do need to link into that. The College of Policing website also now have an ethics portal where they have ethical dilemmas on them for teaching. So you know, so they do have access.
Thanks, Chris. There's a very long question here. I'll try to summarize it. So it sort of has two parts to it. One is about this crisis of legitimacy again. Do you see this as unique to police work, or is it just part of a bigger crisis in contemporary liberal society about the justification of all our basic institutions? And then secondly, are are there any other virtues that come to your mind besides humility that need to be prioritized and promoted more robustly in police education?
So firstly, around the crisis of legitimacy, I think it is more widespread across society. So I think that, and that's why I referenced, that kind of phenomenon or threat, if you like, of ad hominem, this principle of attacking the messenger rather than the message, because I think that's becoming more prevalent. We've seen that in, the term fake news is commonplace now. We've seen what's played out in the US, has been referenced by some of the other speakers in the last couple of weeks, and the drivers behind that. So the validity, to encroach on that subject, the validity otherwise of the presidential election wasn't really a question for the people who stormed the Capitol. They dismissed the evidence base, and those are kind of that's an extreme example, but you can draw that across many areas that impact society at the moment, and policing is one of those. But I think policing will always be at risk of this, because it impacts so much on everybody's lives, and we are fortunately, certainly in the UK, a very accessible profession. I asked a question once, because I do a lot of work around, as you picked up from data analytics, etc. And I asked the question of some colleagues in civil society organisations around that particular issue, but also, I've dealt with the same organisation around stop and search, etc., or different areas of policing legitimacy, or impact policing legitimacy. Why do you focus so much around police use of data analytics? There are many organisations, many public services that are exploring the greater use of data analytics. The security services will be doing lots of things in this space, but it's always policing that we come back to. Why is that? And the answer really was well, because you are accessible, because we can challenge you and you will respond. So we should draw some strength from that, really, that we sometimes fear the criticism and the challenge, but actually we should embrace it, because I think it demonstrates that we are making progress around our legitimacy. So the crisis of legitimacy, yes, potentially, but actually, there's a lot of positives to be drawn from there. And then around the second part, around the virtues, I'm struggling to think of something more important at the moment, but I wouldn't underestimate the relevance of humility, because I think we have to recognise that we will constantly challenge for the reasons that I've just described, and actually being humble enables us to address that and build that legitimacy in anticipation of that forthcoming challenge, rather than in response to the challenge in a more defensive way, which would be less humble, perhaps. So humility for me is the biggest one.
Thanks, Chris.
Kristján?
Yeah.
May I make just a brief comment?
Sure.
Yeah. Absolutely accept totally everything Chris has just said. I'm just thinking about the second part of the question around the other virtues, and one of loyalty comes to mind, and loyalty is a double-edged sword. And I think anybody who's going to be working and researching in this area would be wise to look at the writings of Rob Reiner. And again, I can provide some support material for that if you'd like it. But loyalty is a double-edged sword in policing, and we can explore that another time. But
yeah, speaking of loyalty, I mean, one of the most common dilemmas that we encounter when we ask people about examples is the dilemma between, or the difficult choice between loyalty and honesty, which often comes up, obviously, in police work as well. John, I've got a question for you regarding the dilemmas again, and the code of ethics. I mean, there seems to be a tension there between having a code of ethics, which is supposed to help people solve difficult issues, and then having these extremely contextual situation-specific situations where no rules or norms seem to sort of be able to cut it. So do you see a tension between a code of ethics and sort of phronesis development towards solving moral dilemmas, or can these two work together?
I think it's important not to view the code of ethics as a magic bullet in itself. It sits within a broader architecture. In terms of situations being, entirely unique and contextual, I think the principle of discretion, it could be argued, is interpreted too broadly in many cases. The traditional orthodoxy was that cases are usually too complex and unique to be comparable. So police officers should be free to exercise a considerable degree of discretion, which is kind of commonly grounded in theories of situational ethics and so forth. However, there are areas in which police discretion can be narrowed. For example, domestic abuse and so on is treated entirely differently now than it was a few years ago, and that can come down to not only the code of ethics, but things as Chris mentioned, risk assessments and data analytics and the responses that are developed in response to those. And if you think about kind of some of the issues I was talking about in my positional paper, there are various tools in the policing world to enhance and integrate the idea of character education. And these include like a list of principles, values and virtues, which the code of ethics is. And within the code of ethics, you have the standards of professional behavior that are the legal requirements that officers must uphold or find themselves subject to disciplinary proceedings. So you have these simple lists, but then you also have various decision-making models that should facilitate good judgment and phronesis, such as the national decision model, which the code of ethics sits at the heart of, and various risk assessment and conflict resolution algorithms. And there should also exist various forms of moral reasoning taking place in training settings, when completing police records, when completing justifications for use of force and so on. And then there should also be a degree of emotional learning through reflective practices, feedback from peers, feedback from administrators, and so on. So the code of ethics exists within that broader context, and all of those cylinders should be firing to establish and continue a police force of integrity over time. And as I mentioned in my paper, there's issues of motivation there, and as Professor McVeen mentioned as well, that officers might not even be able to recognize the ethical dilemma in the first place because their attention has never been brought to it, or they're not motivated to think about it and to address it. And it's heartening to hear that Professor McVeen is putting together such a database, because I deliver a professional policing degree that's licensed by the College of Policing, and we're in our second year now, and I've never received one scenario or one ethical dilemma from the College of Policing that I'm supposed to deliver to my students. Everything we create ourselves, and that's a major issue if there's an issue of awareness or the lack thereof.
Thanks, John. We're getting a lot of questions now, so I have to sort of pick and choose. I think I'll ask Ron next. There's a question about the problem of police brutality. Can we tackle the problem of police brutality by promoting more effectively equality and diversity training among police officers, and if so, how? Or is it also a matter of ensuring that more BAME applicants are given opportunities to join the police force, thus making policing more representative and less white dominated?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a really good question. I'm not convinced that issues of use of force, the over-policing of some communities, deaths in police custody, particularly through victims suffering mental health episodes, will necessarily be addressed through the recruitment of additional BAME officers. I think the evidence isn't particularly convincing that would be the case if we look at the United States, for example. But what we could say is that there is an issue of trust and confidence in policing and police legitimacy. And there is no doubt in my mind that police legitimacy increases with the police service itself reflecting much more closely the communities that they serve. So it's absolutely vital for policing that numbers of BAME officers and female officers, for that matter, increases within policing. That's a key issue. But in terms of, you know, this phrase of police brutality, I guess what the questioner is talking about is the, you know, issues of excessive use of force, if you like, which can amount to, you know, on a scale of handcuffing someone whilst they are searched under Section 1 of PACE, under Stop and Search 2, you know, deaths in police custody that are very, very serious. But I'm not convinced, I think there is research in the United States, I'm not convinced that more officers of a diverse background would prevent these incidents occurring, but there is definitely an area of trust and confidence for communities that must mean more officers of diverse appearance are recruited into policing.
Thanks, Ron. There's a question for you, Chris, pressing you again on this humility point you made. How explicit is the language of virtue, for example, of humility within police education and training? I mean, would you be referring to virtues like this in CPD courses or sort of in daily engagements with police officers, or is this something more that will be discussed just at the academic level, but not so much, you know, within the police station?
No, I think the language of virtues is not discussed enough in policing. I think, and that's one of the reasons why my own organisation has started to do more work with the Jubilee Centre, because I think it needs to be discussed more widely, and it needs to be more commonplace. But the introduction of the Code of Ethics a few years ago, forgive me, I can't remember the exact year it was brought in. It was only about 2013, I think, somewhere around there, off the top of my head. You know, that was a step in the right direction. So there's been a great deal of subjectivity around what's important in policing, and Andy made reference to loyalty before. So that's been a strong theme through policing historically. But then arguably, you could say that too much loyalty in the wrong direction leads to unethical behaviours. The Code of Ethics was an important step for policing to provide a framework and a point of reference, and police officers and staff need to have a level of discretion in their decision making, because we operate in such a complex environment. But if we're all pointed to our national decision making model and reminded that your values and your ethics sit at the heart of that, and when you get to those options and you think, right, which is the right path to take, then at least it's a nudge, hopefully, in the right direction if we're familiar with the Code of Ethics. But the broader range of virtues, I think, needs to be expanded upon, and that's why, you know, the work hopefully we'll be doing in the Jubilee Centre, building that into the principles of training for police officers are so important. And from my own background, you know, my previous post was head of professional standards, but professional standards departments are kind of often frowned upon by police officers and thought to be a threat to, you know, to a good copper, which is an absolute nonsense. No other profession in the world would consider the concept of professionalism being a threat to them doing a good job. So moving away from the language of the implementation of professional standards to the integration of virtues, I think would be a really positive step for policing.
I'm glad to hear that, Chris. There's a follow-up question, not necessarily for you. I mean, any of the speakers could sort of respond to this. So if we want to sort of enhance or increase the language of virtue in police education, then obviously the question of relativity and context specificity comes up. So are the same virtues in policing necessarily the ones that really matter in an inner city like London and in Somerset, or would there be different virtues for different places or different contexts?
Shall I come in there?
Oh, go on,
sorry, I think Peter raised his hand first, so okay.
Sorry,
Sorry, I wanted to. There was a couple of things, and I certainly wanted to come to that one. So I just wanted to put the other side of humility, because there is a rather good study by an American academic called Herbert on community policing, and whilst he does emphasise the value of humility, or subservience as he calls it, he also points out that there are occasions when the police have to adopt an independent, separated stance, and that might be a separated stance from their politicians. And we've just seen the chief of one of the largest police forces in the country have to step down on the basis, I think, of not challenging enough some of the some of his institutional sovereigns, both internally and externally, over crime recording. And that's a problem. That's a balance that chiefs and senior leaders quite often fall into, which is the following the institutional sovereigns when there's a bigger moral prize that needs to be pursued, and it's a bloody difficult one in the institutional context where a PCC has so much leverage over a chief constable, and that actually does provide the answer to your what are the challenges in different places. Well, given that in the UK, in the England and Wales system, you've got one-to-one marking with somebody who's been elected for one set of reasons versus somebody else who's been elected for a different set of reasons, and that person literally has the power of hire or fire. A one-to-one conversation in which an individual says to you, "I don't have confidence in you, time to go," does put a chief constable in a very weak position, and we've seen rather too many, and we've seen one or two recently retired chief constables speaking quite loudly about some of the issues, and they are sadly rather what many of us predicted they would be prior to these changes. And it highlights the fact the institutional sovereign context of policing is a critical component of how moral choices are exercised, and indeed the types of individual who are appointed to positions, and some of those are the folk for whom subservience is perhaps rather too high on the agenda. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Alison, do you want to add something more on the relativity angle?
Yes, I wanted to come in on the lexicon and then ethical leadership. So when we started, in terms of some of the lexicon around virtues or ethics, we found that police officers didn't really want to engage with the lexicon, but 5 years later, they're quite happy, they're quite comfortable using some of these words with ethical dilemma and so on and so forth. So I think, they're developing their own ethical lexicon, which is really good, for them. Humility, it makes me smile because actually one of the virtues for the Royal Marines is humility. Also another one is cheerfulness in the face of adversity. So I always find that quite amusing. But something that hasn't been discussed here, which I think we can talk about, ethical dilemmas and how police officers and staff deal with those. But actually police leadership, ethical leadership, is probably significantly more important in creating an ethical culture and in creating an environment in which police officers can start to understand and practice what it is to be ethical. It is about leadership as well, and leadership from the top to the bottom. So we know that most people are influenced by their immediate leaders in terms of ethics. So the sergeants and inspectors is probably more critical than the chief officer group in terms of ethical culture. So I'll just add, I'll finish at that point.
Well, thanks, Alison. I think that's a really good point to finish on. I really enjoyed this webinar. I hope all of you, the viewers, will have enjoyed it too. So lots of thanks to our speakers, to Peter, to Alison, to Ron, to Chris, to John, and to Andy for their papers and for the responses to the questions. Aidan has raised his hand. Do you want to say something, or are you just cheering them on and thanking them? Okay, that's fine. I'll say this for the third time, but it bears repeating that the full papers will be available on the web if you want to consult them. All this discussion will feed into our work in the police project. As I said, the survey goes online this week. We'll be interviewing people as well in the next few months. We'll be publishing a report about our initial findings in the spring, and then in the summer and the autumn we'll continue to work on design of educational interventions for both police science students and for professionals in policing. So all this gives us a lot of food for thought for future work in the police project. And I thank you all again, the speakers, and all of you in the audience today. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.